In recent years, farmers in Africa and Asia have been grappling with a novel foe, the fall armyworm. This ferocious pest is rapidly spread across the world, potentially threatening food security and livelihoods. But there's hope. A variety of low-cost agroecological approaches offer sustainable and effective solutions for controlling this pest. Inspired by natural ecosystems, agroecology is a holistic approach to agriculture that promotes biodiversity, plant resilience, and secures livelihoods.
Oliver,
by harnessing natural processes and minimizing reliance
I can hear
on
you. We're
chemicals,
just waiting for a few
agroecological
more folks
practices
to come
promote
over,
beneficial
particularly the ones
organisms,
from the
such as natural enemies,
for different
helping
embassies
farmers
that
manage
will be
fall
opening the
armyworm
session.
infestations while
So-
preserving the environment and
maybe
supporting
you
sustainable
can
farming.
tell me
There are
when
three
we
basic
open the
components
webinar room.
to agroecological approaches.
I don't want
The
to
first
keep people on hold
is growing healthy
online too long
plants
because
healthy
online
plants are much more
time
resistant to
perception is
pests,
very different.
much more capable
All
of
right.
responding
You think the
to
thing
pest
is not
damage so
for
that you
sure.
don't incur yield
All right,
losses.
I think you
if the
can
plant is
start
attacked.
now because people
And then
start
the second
arriving now.
one is
So we
about
could open.
increasing biodiversity.
So they
at
could
the
also
field scale
that the
and
people
also
here
at
on
the
this side is
landscape
also
scale.
preparing as they
Because
are.
lots
Okay,
of
so
pest
maybe I
natural
can
enemies, these are
greet the people as they
organisms that
join
live
the
in the
webinar
fields and around
Fantastic.
explain them
feed
that
on the
we
pest.
are
These animals do a
settling in
tremendous
and,
job of
right.
controlling
is
the
about
pest
to,
abundance.
sit
The
down
last
and
solution
start.
is particular
Perfect.
management
Thanks.
options
Alright,
that
so
you
I'm
might select
Okay, thank you.
to try and control pests. For example, maybe releasing natural enemies, managing fields with intercrops, for example, or even some measures such as using non-chemical means of controlling the pest
Recording in
directly,
progress.
such as picking or putting sand in the funnels and so forth.
Farmers can use a variety of agroecological approaches to successfully manage fall armyworm. Integrated soil fertility management, including mulching of crop residues or compost, leads to robust plants that are resilient to pest attacks and can recover from damage. Intercropping, pheromone traps, and beneficial insects such as parasitoids or assassin bags can also be released to prey on fall armyworm larvae.
Just want to greet the attendees that are joining us. Our session is about to start in a few minutes. Thank you for being with us today.
The maize, the cowpea, even the beans itself. And the farmer will have household income security.
Agroecology is not only a solution to managing fall armyworm, but also a path towards reliant and sustainable agriculture for a better future.
Wildfires, heat waves, food and water shortages. This is our reality today, and it's going to get so much worse. El Niño is officially here, which means global warming could reach the critical 1.5 degrees within the next few years. So what can we do? All over the world, grassroots champions, traditional leaders, indigenous peoples, youth and women are building local remedies to the global crises we face. Join us on the 11th and 12th of October to craft a survival guide for a planet in crisis and build a new vision for Earth. Connect and network with top innovators, scientists, creators and financiers. Find hope through art, music and inspiring stories, and help turn vision into action. We'll see you at GLF Nairobi.
Insect pests are among the many threats to farmers' yields and livelihoods. Chemical pesticides are often not very effective because fall armyworm is resistant to many chemicals. Unfortunately, these pesticides also kill the pest's natural enemies. They can also be dangerous to farmers and their families. Spraying chemical pesticides without using protective equipment exposes us to toxins in the air. Our research shows that fall armyworm is not as damaging as it seems. Most of the time, it only eats some leaves, and the maize can easily recover without yield loss. Unfortunately, there are many natural enemies that can effectively control this particular pest and protect your plants. Let's review some best practices to neutralize an attack and keep your plants healthy. First of all, good soil management helps to produce healthy plants that are resistant to pest attack and can recover from damage. Intercropping with plants such as legume crops, Gliricidia and Tephrosia helps boost natural soil nitrogen and enhances plant health. Biodiverse fields encourage natural enemies to make their homes there and keep plants safe from pest attacks. If you feel the need to spray your fields to control the fall armyworm, think before spraying with chemical pesticides. Choose a biological pesticide like neem. These are highly effective but do not kill natural enemies.
Wildfires, heat waves, food and water shortages. This is our reality today, and it's going to get so much worse. El Niño is officially here, which means global warming could reach the critical 1.5 degrees within the next few years. So what can we do? All over the world, grassroots champions, traditional leaders,
and as our guests who are here in the room take their seats, please make sure those who are online, you are able to also post your questions in the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform. And the speakers who are joining us online would also have the opportunity, the possibility to respond directly to your questions. We will also try to pick up some of those questions and ask them here on the floor, should time allow us to do so. But yes, thanks very much. So yes, good morning again, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Oliver Oliveros. I'm the coordinator of the Agroecology Coalition. And welcome to today's event, which we have entitled Prospects for Achieving Equitable Food Systems Through Agroecology, which is being organized within the UNGA 78th Science Week Summit. This event is being co-organized by the Agroecology Coalition and the TPP on agroecology in collaboration with the French permanent representation in the UN, and also with the support of the Senegalese permanent representation here in the UN as well. Welcome. Please. All right, the Agroecology Coalition, just a few words, is essentially working to accelerate the food systems transformation through agroecology. It is composed of almost 50 countries, member states, but also more than 130 organizations from civil society, from farmers organizations, indigenous peoples, research, UN agencies, etc. And the TPP, or the Transformative Partnership Platform on Agroecology, works to address key knowledge and implementation gaps to support agroecological transitions. So these two networks are working together to advance agroecology agenda. So food systems, as you probably know, are responsible for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, 80% of deforestation, 70% of freshwater use, and the single greatest cause of terrestrial biodiversity loss and land degradation. But with 1/3 of the Earth's surface being degraded, the ecosystem's ability to produce healthy and nutritious food is limited. A powerful lever, agroecology provides sustainable solutions to issues of soil degradation, climate, biodiversity, food security, and nutrition, including precarious livelihoods and social inequalities faced by farmers and food systems workers. The SDG agenda calls for a new agricultural approach to ensure sufficient, safe, and nutritious food respecting human rights. There is a growing recognition that agroecology is a powerful lever for the sustainable transformation of our food systems. Not only is the transformation of food systems through agroecology fully aligned with SDGs, it is also fully compatible with the Paris Climate Agreement's long-term goal, the post-2020 targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the land degradation neutrality objectives of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. This year in Rome, we had the UN Food Systems Summit Stocktake, where food systems actors gathered together to reflect on what we have achieved since 2021 and what needs to be done still in the future. Towards the end of the year, the world will be focusing their attention to Dubai during the COP on climate, where food is high in the agenda. And next year, 3 Rio conventions will be meeting. And in September 2024, here in New York, the Summit for the Future will also take place. So this event is thus an opportunity to talk about agroecology as a powerful lever, as I've mentioned, in transforming our food systems. And our conversation today will focus on issues that are very important in agroecology: equity and evidence, and how these two are linked to science and policy. So without much further ado, I'd like to call on Her Excellency, Nathalie Broders, the Deputy Permanent Representative of France to the United Nations, for her opening remarks.
Do you have to?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Oliver, and dear organizers, dear participants here in the room. And I understand that online via Zoom, we have more than 500 participants. I don't know if they are all online, but I would like to greet them too. I'm very honored to open this very special thematic day on agroecology, organized in the context of the Science Summit of the 78th United Nations Assembly. Let me also greet my colleagues here around me at the table. I know that some of them are going to join us also this morning. And let me say just a few things. I don't want to be too long. I'm not an expert, but over the years, we have seen a growing enthusiasm for agroecology, and it's now being recognized as a solution to address altogether the issues of hunger, malnutrition, of poverty in rural areas, climate change, biodiversity loss, soil degradation, while supporting family farmers, smallholders. And France has been very committed to promote this concept. You know that in France, we also committed ourselves to changing our production models in order to combine this economic, social, and environmental efficiency. And this is the agroecological project. So this is an ambitious public policy, actually. It involves a lot of partners on the ground. It's an effort that is rooted in the diversity of our territories, in their singularity, their uniqueness, but also based on the dissemination of knowledge and innovation. So since the launch of this coalition in 2021, we've been fully committed to promote the concept in different arenas, different international fora. And last year was a great victory. As you know, the concept was inserted in Montreal framework on biodiversity, adopted during the COP15 summit. And I can once again really congratulate the Agroecological Coalition and its stakeholders for their successful mobilization. We know also that last summer, Brazil, Germany joined the coalition, which is also a strong political signal and sign. And together, I think today there's one message, is that it's important to keep this momentum and to expand it wherever you can, including in all the fora. Today, next week, during UNGA, obviously, during all the debate in the different resolutions in Second Commission, the next climate COP28, of course, there will be a dedicated day on the food system. So I think it will be a great opportunity to also promote the agroecology. In the context of the 13 IFAD replenishment cycle, France is co-championing with Angola. And of course, looking forward, if we think about the Summit of Future, this has to be included in the Summit of Future, obviously. So we also support nationally different projects that, of course, promotes and illustrates the potential of agroecology. And I'm thinking of the Great Green Wall Accelerator, for instance. And as Oliver reminded us, and as we shall see this morning, of course, the development of agroecology requires a lot of aspects: the right enabling policies, regulatory, financial environments, the appropriate metrics, evidence sets to successfully outreach the farmers and the governments. And of course, the Agroecology Coalition has a very strong role to play in this regard to disseminate the good practices. So I've already been very long, too long, because I'm not the expert once again. This morning, we're here to hear the real ones, the experts, and I'm happy to let them the floor now to all the partners, but also beneficiaries to talk, who are going to testify and give their testimony about ecology. So I wish you a very fruitful discussion this morning, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. Without much further ado, let's keep the ball rolling, and we'll give the floor first to our keynote speaker, Fergus Sinclair, to walk us through evidence around agroecology. Fergus.
Thank you very much. Next slide. In fact, there we go. So I think we're all aware that food systems transformation is expected to do some really heavy lifting in COP28 coming up in UAE in December. And it's not before time, because as Oliver mentioned, food systems are responsible for about a third of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. And that means that we've got these connected global challenges of broken food systems, hunger, biodiversity loss, climate change, and very widespread land and water degradation. And obviously, these are all interacting, so they can't be dealt with individually, although we've got different UN conventions that are dealing with them separately. So the interconnectedness is not being addressed as solidly as it should. We need systemic solutions. Next slide. And this is scientific. So it's not just people talking about the interactions, it is the interactions amongst these things that really create the problems. So the interaction between agricultural intensification and climate change is what's causing a 50% reduction in insect abundance and 27% reduction in insect diversity. And it's worse in the tropics, where the interaction is really beginning to play. Next slide. So we hear a lot about food system transformation, but most of what we hear is not actually a whole transformation, but just incremental improvements to a model that is essentially unsustainable. So intensive monoculture supported by environmentally disruptive chemicals with a largely separate intensive livestock sector is simply not going to deliver a sustainable agricultural and food system. And we're not just talking about the production, the farming, we're also looking at what are people consuming, how much food loss and waste is there in the system. Transformation of agriculture means moving away from that model. Now, the good news, next slide, is that over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of evidence published on the feasibility of agroecological solutions. So this is a paper from Nature Sustainability last year, which shows that there is a positive relationship between diversity of plants, crop diversity, and productivity. So you don't get less production when you have a mixture of plants instead of a monoculture, you get more, providing, of course, you count all of the things that are being produced in the field. And very significantly, if you've got legumes in that plant mixture, you can substitute for inorganic, industrially produced nitrogen. Next slide. That was data from long-term trials across Africa and Europe. A meta-analysis, 420-odd trials across the globe, looking at the power of legumes to substitute for inorganic nitrogen, again shows yield increases in the main crop where you've got legume rotations. So again, this is not little case study data from here or there. This is a major global meta-analysis that gives us real confidence that these are solutions that can be adopted globally. Next slide. Now, I'm sure you can all read that slide very clearly. The important, the important part about it is it's showing the importance of industrial nitrogen used in agriculture for greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at those, the critical thing is that synthetic nitrogen is responsible for about 6.2 to 7.5%, depending on how you estimate things, of greenhouse gas emissions from food systems. So it's huge. It's 2% of all anthropogenic emissions. And about 40% of that comes from the production process itself, and the rest from nitrous oxide and other gases after it's been used in the field. Next slide. Now, you make me think, the cavalry's coming over the hill. Green nitrogen will solve the problem because you can get your fertilizer, your ammonia from green hydrogen. Unfortunately, that simply isn't the case over the time that we have available to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to avoid catastrophic climate change impacts. It takes 25 times as much energy to produce the same amount of nitrogen from green hydrogen as from grey hydrogen, and that's equivalent. If you look at what the requirement would be for our global nitrogen fertilizer, it's more than the total energy produced in the EU in 2022 from solar, wind, and hydropower combined. So let's not think that that's an easy solution. Next slide. And of course, it's not just the issue of the greenhouse gas emissions, it's also food security. And as we've seen with fluctuating prices of nitrogen fertilizer, that threatens food security in a number of developing countries because it becomes difficult to get foreign exchange to purchase fertilizer. And a lot of fertilizer is subsidized, so it comes down to government purchasing. Next slide. So, what is the best modern technology for getting nitrogen into crop plants? Is it our conventional centralized production of industrial nitrogen, or is it biological fixation on farms? And it's not only the issue of the technology, it's also who owns the factory. On the farm, the factory is rhizobia connected to plants based on solar energy. It's empowering farmers. They are the ones who are producing their own nitrogen from existing resources. So the potential is there. The difficulty is it's much more knowledge intensive. There are lots of different legume species. You have to get your soil conditions right. You've got to manage things. And this is absolutely the cutting edge of science as well as traditional practice, because understanding the soil microbiome and managing it is right where science is put at the moment. Next slide. So the 13 principles of agroecology, which were articulated in the high-level panel of experts report and include the 10 FAO elements, are a critical way of addressing not just the agroecosystem, the farming part, farming in harmony with nature, but also the whole food system in terms of bringing in governance issues, fairness in trade, social values and diets, and connecting producers and consumers. And these 13 principles, when applied locally, lead to diverse practice that is meeting these challenges together rather than one at a time. Next slide. Very importantly, this means very different transition pathways in different places, depending where you're starting from and the context within which you're operating. So in India, for example, next slide, in Andhra Pradesh, one of the biggest experiments in agroecology globally, you have people shifting to natural farming that doesn't use artificial chemicals in the process, does use a lot of plant extracts and various other things. Next slide. And this, across the state of Andhra Pradesh, the early indications are that yields are not going down as a result of a switch away from chemicals to natural farming. And next slide. And we understand why this is, and it's because of higher soil moisture content, lower soil temperatures, and higher earthworm abundance in the natural farming compared to the conventional. Next slide. Obviously, in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see from this nitrogen use map, people are actually, there's a lot of smallholder farmers who aren't using a lot of fertilizer. So we might be thinking, well, perhaps this doesn't matter for African farmers, but it does, because as we've already seen, there are links to food security. There are links to our people having to purchase fertilizer, enter into risk. And it's necessary to intensify, but it can be done ecologically using biological nitrogen fixation, as we've seen. So Africa is able to leapfrog from its current position to higher levels of productivity, but without doing the environmental damage that has happened in the north. Next slide. And there are examples of how this happens. The critical thing is that different species, as I mentioned before, in different contexts are going to work. So it's an options by context approach that we need, not single silver bullets. And that means a revolution in the way that rural advisory and research are operating, so that you're supporting local innovation by farmers that suits the conditions that they have, rather than coming along with blanket recommendations for everybody. Next slide. And Rachel is here in the audience. She was the lead author on a paper that looked at how this translates to food security and nutrition outcomes, and across a whole range of the literature was able to show 78% of the time that there were positive outcomes from adopting agroecological practices. And the more complex, the more different practices that were combined in the same farm, the greater the outcomes. Next slide. And this has come through now to the IPCC report last year that clearly recommends agroecology as one of the ways that we can contribute to addressing climate change and other global challenges. Next slide. The Transformative Partnership Platform on Agroecology came out of the HLP report from CFS. It gave birth, next slide, as Oliver was mentioning, at UNFSS. The group of Friends of Agroecology in Rome and CFS, together with the TPP, produced the Agroecology Coalition, which has now got the 50 countries and the African Union, the European Union, and ECOWAS as members. And that is where sorry, next slide. And that's where I want to finish, which is that stressing that the coalition is a coalition of the willing. It was very difficult to get things through the HLPE process because everybody has to agree. Where countries are coming together voluntarily in order to take things forward, the pace is much faster. And so the coalition really marks an ability to make changes, lead a way forward, and others can follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fergus, for the presentation. But of course, as we also say, the coalition is only as strong as its weakest members. So if we want this to work, then all of us who are part of this coalition should do our part. Thanks again. Fairness, participation, equity are all important elements of agroecology. So based on Fergus's presentation, what does it all mean to people on the ground, particularly for farmers and their husbands? Farmers and their husbands, because majority of people, of farmers, are women. So with that, I'd like to turn over the floor to our friend Jemima Njuki to talk to us around the equity issues around agroecology. Jemima, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Thank you so much for inviting me. today's important conversation. As Oliver said, my name is Jemima Njuki. I work at UN Women, and I lead our work on economic empowerment. But for many, many years, I've worked on gender equality and food systems and agriculture. And so it's also really gratifying to see a lot of people in the room that I have worked with before. I think it's such an opportune moment for us to be speaking about agroecology, to be speaking about how we need transformation in our food systems. But that transformation cannot just be a technical transformation. We also need a transformation of power and power systems within our food systems. And so that's why this conversation on equity, on fairness, on equality really must be part of the conversations that we have today. It is also an opportune moment because of the convergence of conversations that's happening right now. We just came from the UN Food Systems stocktake a couple of weeks ago. We are preparing for COP28, where food systems are going to be an important conversation. We have the SDG Summit happening this weekend. And what has been very gratifying for me is to see food systems really as a strong part of the SDG Acceleration Day on Sunday, as one of the what we're calling the SDG accelerators that the Secretary General is pushing forward. And that was not always, we always used to say that the conversation on food systems was so prominent in Rome and not so in New York. And what we are starting to see is that shift very quickly in terms of the recognition of the role of food systems for a lot of other things. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and not because this community doesn't know what these inequalities we talk about are, but it is really to highlight some of the inequalities that we need to be thinking about as we think about agroecology as a transformational approach in our food systems. And the first inequality I want to talk about is the inequality in access to safe and nutritious foods. As we know, food is human dignity. And so when we have inequalities in a system that is not guaranteeing food to everybody, then we know we have a problem. And the last report by the UN agencies showed that between 691 and 783 million people do not have enough food. And this is in a world where we know we are actually producing enough food for everybody. So definitely we have a problem because that food is not getting to who it needs to get to. And I think what has been very worrying for all of us is that the people who are producing the food that we eat, the farmers, are hungrier than everyone else. So we see more hunger in rural areas where food is being produced. 33% of people in rural areas in 2022 were hungry compared to just around 25% in urban areas. And so we must also be looking at agroecological solutions as solutions to our smallholder farmers as well. The second inequality I want to talk about is the inequality of wealth and poverty. Last week, we released at UN Women together with DESA, the gender snapshot, and we do this every year, looking at all the SDGs and how we're doing on gender equality. And one of the shocking figures that snapshot contains is that by 2030, if we continue as we are now, 360 million people, women, not actually people, 360, not generally, women are people, please don't get me wrong, but 360 million women are going to be living in extreme poverty. Now that's about the population of the US. So it's not a small number. And we would need to be moving 26 times faster than we are now to make sure that we can get to zero hunger. And so as we have the discussions today, is agroecology a solution for the poverty that we see, especially in rural areas? I know Fergus had very nice diagrams about the nitrogen and all of it. How do we center people as well in that conversation? And the third inequality I want to talk about is gender inequality. And we know, I think everybody talks about this, that gender equality and food systems transformation are intertwined, and we cannot achieve one without the other, just as we cannot achieve the other SDGs without SDG 5. And this year, FAO released a report on the status of women in agri-food systems. And there was a lot of contradictions in that report. It showed us the important role that women are playing in agri-food systems. 66% of women in sub-Saharan Africa are working in agri-food systems, 71% in Southern Asia. They are earning 82 cents for every dollar that men are earning in agri-food systems. They own 15%, only 15% of the land that they are producing food in. We have a gender and food insecurity gap that has refused to close. Only 2% of the board seats of organizations that govern our food systems are held by women from low and middle income countries. And I have said this before, if we believe women are good enough to produce our food, we must also believe that they're good enough to be leaders in food systems. The fourth inequality that we really must be thinking about is the impact of climate change on countries and on people that are contributing the least to it. We know, for example, data by Oxfam saying the richest 1% emit more than twice as much CO2 as the bottom 50% of the world. And yet we know climate finance is not going to those that are most affected. What I would like to say after talking about those four inequalities is that these inequalities are happening by choice. It is not by chance. It is how we have decided we want to organize our systems and structures so that they're not serving everybody. And so there's a power conversation that we need to talk about, finding new ways of redistributing power in our food systems, finding new ways of doing things. And as we think of agroecology, first as not a new thing, but a really important way of producing and managing our food, our soils, and the environment, we really must also talk about how do we make sure that there is equity and fairness within that process. I was at the Food Systems Summit in 2021, mobilizing women's movements, mobilizing women, trying to put gender equality at the center of the conversations. And one of the things that women said over and over again is they are in the food system. They said, we are in the food system, we are producing, we are marketing, we are processing food. We are taking care of the environment, but the systems that you have put in place are not working for us. So we are doing our part, but you need to do your part to fix these systems. So for those of us who are working and thinking about agroecology, what are these systems that we need to fix? We need to fix our extension systems. We need to fix our research systems. We need to fix our financial systems. We need to fix our market systems so that they prioritize those who are most left behind. I always say gender inequality is a wicked problem, and wicked problems don't have one single bullet solution. So even as we work on agroecology, just having women at the table is not going to be enough. We need to do much more than that. So I would like to just mention to you 4 things to think about as we go through this conversation today. First, we have to ensure that women have access to the resources and technologies that they need, whether these are climate smart technologies and innovations, whether this is climate information, whether it's information on the right agroecological principles that will work for their firms, whether it is the digital tools that allow them to link to markets. We have to put this at the center. If you have a program, a project, the question you ask is, am I ensuring that women have access to the tools that they need to be productive? The second is women's leadership. Women and girls are tackling food insecurity. They're tackling climate change on the ground everywhere. Their participation and leadership, we under-support them, we under-resource them, we undervalue that leadership, we under-recognize that leadership. And so we need to prioritize women's leadership. The third is a lot of these gaps that we see, what we call the gender gaps, are because of structural inequalities. And we need to deal with those structural inequalities in a transformative way. So we need to address the gender and social norms that continue to hold women back, including norms around women's ownership of land. We are always shocked. Every 2 years, we carry out a study on gender attitude. The 2022 survey showed us, for example, that about a quarter of people in the world, and this is across countries ranging from Japan to Vietnam to Ethiopia to Sweden, in times of food shortages, priority to eat should be given to men. That's a quarter of the world saying that. A third of the world saying that when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. So there's still a lot to do in shifting mindsets of people, because these norms influence what resources women can access and own. They influence whether they can eat or not eat, and what their priority is on the table. But we know these norms change, they are changing. They're examples of gender transformative approaches that are working. And the fourth ingredient is policies. As we put together policies to govern the work that we do, making sure that women are part of the policy making, but those policies also prioritize women and they prioritize gender equality. And these are not just policies to do with land or technologies. It is also policies that address the unpaid care that women have to shoulder. Policies that guarantee social protection, especially for women in rural areas. And we must underpin that with really collecting data that shows us whether we are making progress or not. I'm going to stop there, but hoping that that provides some food for thought in terms of some of the conversations we need to have in the context of agroecology, in the context of how we transform our food systems, not just from this scientific, and gender is scientific as well, but really making sure that people are at the center of that transformation. Thank you very much, Oliver.
People at the center. Thanks very much, Jemima, for the presentation and for sharing your insights on this. At this juncture, I'd like to also welcome our panel discussants who are joining us live via Zoom platform today to offer their reflections, but also to respond to a few questions that we have that is around this topic. Our first discussant is Ambassador Gabriel Ferrero y de Loma Osorio, who is the chair of the UN Committee on World Food Security. He's addressing us from Rome. Buenos días, Gabriel.
Buenos días, Oliver. Am I well heard?
We could hear you very well. Thank you. Fantastic. Okay, here's a question. Agroecology supporters and movers always cite, and as you have just heard this, the 13 principles of agroecology, which came up from the CFS's HLPE report. The question is, how is CFS advocating for further support on agroecology? Is there an appetite among countries and CFS stakeholders to further take it up? And how do you think the uptake of agroecology into national policies can be further promoted so the issues that are raised by both Fergus and Jemima could be addressed?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oliver, and good morning in New York, colleagues, friends, and ladies and gentlemen. Before going to the topic, I must start thanking the Agroecology Coalition, of course, and the transformative partnership, the governments of France and Senegal for inviting the chairperson of the Committee on World Food Security to join you today at this very, very important event, I believe. But it gives me also a lot of satisfaction being ambassador at large from Spain for global food security. To be here today. Spain is part of the coalition. It's one of the biggest countries in Europe on certified ecological agriculture, so it is double pleasure to join you today. So, colleagues, thank you for your question, Oliver, of course, but before going to the core of your question, allow me to rewind a bit, to go backwards to provide you a short reflection on the background of what led us to the existence of the Committee on World Food Security of the United Nations policy recommendations on agroecological and other innovative approaches for sustainable food systems to enhance food security and nutrition. And in an intergovernmental committee that it's also as inclusive as the Committee on World Food Security of the United Nations is, this takes a lot of time. And it is in 2018, already before the pandemic, when the committee requested the high-level panel of experts of the committee, the HLP, to develop a report on agroecology, on agroecological and other innovative approaches in view of the existing already evidence of the impact of climate change, biodiversity loss, and desertification. So it was more than 110, and let me underscore this, hours of negotiations amongst the member states and all the stakeholders that led to the final agreement of these policy recommendations that were adopted on a special plenary session in 2021. So I'd say, recap a bit to put the CFS recommendations, I believe, on the right perspective, because the CFS policy recommendations, as the other outcomes, policy outcomes of this committee, as it will be actually the next policy agreement, which is the voluntary guidelines on gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment. And I have been delighted to see and listen to my dear friend Jemima to refer very strongly about that. It will happen the next October. But as the rest of the policy outcomes, this is not a document. It's not just a document. It is not a prescription from a UN agency. It means, in its full words, a voluntary international consensus that has been informed by science at the beginning, by the high-level panel of experts report. And here resides its transformative power. So as the rest of the policy outcomes of the Committee on World Food Security, this is what makes them an interesting, important, and empowering tool for those that are willing to advance the transformative agenda in food systems and agriculture. So it is up to all of us as a public good to use it as an advocacy tool, for our governments to use it in the design of our public policies, for parliamentarians to use them for informing laws and their own actions, and civil society, of course, for making us all accountable. So as such, the CFS policy recommendations, this is important. What be underlined is that they don't represent a single approach for achieving food security and nutrition. And the policy recommendations on agroecology actually put a lot of emphasis on the need to adopt the context adapted and context appropriate locally, at the territorial level, and nationally, of course, the context appropriate transitions pathways. Now getting closer to your question, Oliver. Well, as an international agreement that was achieved at the committee, of course, the 140 member states and that are part of the committee and all the stakeholders that are involved in it are the ones that are called to be the implementers on its own mandates and on its own spaces of the policy recommendations and the other agreements. as the committee is a committee, it's not an implementing agency. And as such, its members and all the stakeholders are advocating for and implementing the CFS policy recommendations on agroecology and other innovative approaches with different intensities. Because we need to be clear, we are still far globally to achieve a consensus on the topic. And this is actually part of the reason why the policy recommendations that the first proposal before 2019 were to focus only on agroecology. They were widened on this scope to include other innovative approaches apart from agroecology. And the current status of the consensus is that indeed there is a wide array of innovative approaches that include also, for example, regenerative agriculture or other climate compatible practices that together with agroecology, that indeed is the innovative approach that is at the spotlight of the policy recommendations, offer solutions to progressing in sustainable agriculture. So if I may, using the jargon of the energy sector, so the policy recommendations points at the challenge of how to advance on the share of agroecology in the agriculture global mix, if we want to put it that way, transitioning from, as soon as possible, from the most harmful parts of that agriculture mix and identifying which are the transitional practices that will still be part of the mix for some years. Of course, as a chairperson, I've been involved in many meetings globally. I've met many ministers in the last 2 years, and no doubt, I mean, I am identifying that very especially in Africa, and this was mentioned before also in Fergus' excellent presentation, I see African leaders and African countries strongly looking at agroecological practices and paradigms as one of the key principles of their own African agricultural development towards 2063 vision and towards the sustainable development goals. And to conclude, to the last part of your question, Oliver, what is needed? Well, I think that, of course, many issues are needed, but I would like to point at 3 at least. The first one is the evidence. What Fergus just presented is extremely important. The growing evidence about the relationship between adopting agroecological practices and not just yields, but also yields, of course, and other societal positive outcomes is extremely important. Bringing together the disciplines so that the whole of the socio-economical impact is underscored, apart from the yields, of course, is very, very important. We will listen later, I understand, to the editor-in-chief of Nature. I think it would be incredibly powerful, a monographic from Nature on the topic to bring together and bring all the attention globally on agroecology, its potential, all the evidence that has been gathered, maybe through a special issue. Or I also always recall the impact of the Lancet series on nutrition about a decade ago, and the way in which the Lancet series on nutrition put together the evidence and brought all the attention at the political level to those solutions. The second one is, of course, financing. It's extremely important to advance on the agenda of leveling the playing field. It is unacceptable if we want to transition and speed up the transition towards food systems that farmers, very especially smallholder farmers and family farmers, operate in a space in which the field is extremely imbalanced. This means remunerating, rewarding those farmers that are really adopting agroecological practices actively, or even because they can't access chemical inputs, with a share of the financing, sorry, climate financing, and the public support that rewards their practices. Or the other side of the coin, so to speak, making internal the costs, the environmental costs of those food, of that food, that it's not minimizing its externalities. So we need to advance on the financing side. And then finally, what we need is also the political consensus advancing, and I hope that this is where the Committee on World Food Security policy recommendations have contributed with in the last couple of years and will in the future. So thank you. Thanks again, Oliver, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thanks for very interesting insights, but also for very concrete ideas in terms of what is needed to move it further. At this juncture, I also want to call in our second panel discussant, who is His Excellency Professor Bitange Ndemo, who is the Kenyan ambassador to Belgium and the European Union. Good morning, Mr. Ambassador. Could you hear us?
I can hear you clearly.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Here's your question, Mr. Ambassador. Dr. Njuki, Jemima Njuki, highlighted the centrality of equity in our pursuit for sustainable food systems. What are your insights on international equity issues? And can you also talk briefly about how African countries are looking at a post-SDG context?
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to come to speak to this audience. Powerful presentations from Fergus and Jemima. And my regards to Jemima because we come from the same place. I would just focus on, because she covered almost everything, but let me talk about international equity issues, which are critical in the context of global development and cooperation. They revolve around ensuring fairness and justice in the distribution of resources, opportunities, and the benefits among countries and their populations. So one of the most significant international inequity issue is the stark wealth disparity between the developed and the developing countries. A handful of high-income countries have access to the majority of the global resources and the economic opportunities, while many of the low-income countries struggle with poverty and limited access to essential services. I would explain why this is a problem to especially the expanding inequity issues between the two areas. When it comes to trade, for example, the global trade rules, because of the power dynamics and the economic systems, often favor the rich nations, thus disadvantaging the poorer countries in international markets. Fair trade practices and addressing economic inequalities between nations are essential components of international equity efforts. What most people don't know, even those in developing countries, is the fact that when developed countries, and this emanates from what Paga said very clearly, that this mass production, which rich countries end up subsidizing and getting it into developing countries, completely destroys agroecological farming methods, especially those in the developing world, by making their production completely uncompetitive and even within the local market, and that destroys it completely. The second other thing which most of us think it is good to get the aid, but people don't think about what causes aid is the carbon emissions, which creates desertification and other issues in the developing world. But then the developed world, because of its power dynamics with the smaller countries, they produce and say, we give you as aid, which completely destroys the power for them to produce. Because when that happens, then you begin to wonder exactly what is going on. And that also leads to a third aspect of the debt burden. In developing countries, which are mostly burdened by high levels of debt, it makes it difficult for them to invest in development projects and social systems. So debt relief initiatives, which people have been advocating, so that they can be able to to produce by themselves doesn't work. So for us to foster the ecological agricultural systems, we must deal with those dynamics which create equity issues. Let me get to your second question on in what happens with post-UN, post SDGs. Africa indeed has some mechanism in place. Agenda 2063, which is a long-term development plan for the continent, which outlines aspirations and goals of African countries for the next 5 decades and aims to drive economic growth, development, and integration. This is beginning to happen. You've seen Africa continental free trade area struggling, but it's gaining traction, and people are beginning to understand the need for them to work together. This agenda seeks to build on the progress made under the SDGs and address specific challenges. Then we are seeing most countries now localizing SDGs. African countries have been actively localizing these SDGs, tailoring them to their unique context and priorities. This involves aligning national development plans with SDGs and involving local governments, civil society, and communities in the implementation process. I can give several examples what's happening in Kenya to see that we align some of our economic plans with the SDGs, and a Vision 30. Vision 30 is what we had envisaged, is actually to deal with some of the issues within the SDGs. We are also seeing regional integration. We have regional economic, we call them RECs, the West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa. African countries are increasingly focusing on these efforts, such as and also fostering what I said earlier, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. These initiatives aim to boost intra-Africa trade, economic growth, and development by creating a single market for goods and services. The youth and gender, and my sister Jemima talked about the difference, the gender problems that we still have. They are lessening. African countries recognize the importance of empowering especially youth and promoting gender equality as essential drivers of development. These priorities are reflected in various national and regional initiatives. We have not gotten there, but we have made progress in that space. One of the last points I want to make is the problem of conflict in Africa, which creates a lot more inequality. You can see, for example, the Sahel region now, which is giving us a proper headache, which is going to create a lot of problems. We need to deal with those issues. There is also, I would say, the involvement of geopolitical powers. So it is not something that we can just wake up today and say, as AU, we deal with it. It is much broader, which we need to all work together and solve the problem. So African countries are committed to addressing their specific challenges while contributing to global efforts to achieve international equity. They understand the importance of sustainability, economic growth, and social development as they navigate the post-SDG context and work towards a brighter future for the continent. That is what I can say for now.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ndemo. And thanks again to Ambassador Ferrero for the very good interventions. There's a lot of issues there that were unpacked, and we've heard about so many of this. It's not, when we talk about agroecology, it's not just about farming. There's also issues around trade, power imbalances, etc. There's a lot of things there to unpack in so little time. That's the challenge. I just wanted to also have a shout out to our 160 plus online participants, and a few questions there were being raised in terms of where is the private sector. We can't afford not to work with them. How can we get their full commitment into agroecological transformation? There are also questions and comments there around how can we bring in a more balanced representation of actors from Africa, Latin America, and Asia in international organizations that are advancing food systems. So these are some of the feedback and some insights that we're getting from our online participants. But we are also mindful of the fact that we have 2 more topics to cover today, and we have 2 more presentations, and within that we will have an opportunity to discuss a little bit as well in our roundtables. So let's make the most out of it, and please reserve your questions and share those ideas and perspectives that you might have in your small roundtable conversations, both here in person in New York and our friends who are joining us as well online. At this point, I'd like to hand over the floor to our friend Rachel Besner-Kerr, professor at Department of Global Development at Cornell University, to moderate the succeeding 2 sessions. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and I'm really honored to participate in this exciting event here in New York City and globally with our online audience. And our second session is going to focus on the need to anchor policies on evidence and research, which is my bailiwick. So I'm happy that this is going to be a focus. It's also going to tackle how to promote conducive policies to further support transformative research and co-innovation with stakeholders on the ground. We know that there is very little research that is actually tackling agroecology globally. A very small proportion, a number of studies have looked at this, and around 1 to 2% currently is dedicated to agroecology, although that is changing. And so I want to turn to Alex Awiti, who is going to talk to us about his analysis on tracking the implementation of the CFS policy recommendations on agroecological approaches. And we're really honored to have him here in the room today. So thank you, Alex.
Hello, mic test.
Okay. Good morning here in New York, and good afternoon to everybody else. Good evening, colleagues who are joining from other parts of the world. I'm going to talk about a national tracking tool that we're developing to track progress in the implementation of the CFS policy recommendations. And I think the ambassador gave a very strong introduction and preface to how we got here and why this is important. So my focus is going to be on what we are learning, because we've piloted this tool now initially in 2 countries, in Kenya and Uganda, and there are certain very interesting insights that is emerging from this process. So Fabio, next slide, please. So I just want to set a context to the CFS policy recommendations to help you understand the genealogy of this and how deeply connected and integrated it is with all the things that we care about. It is informed by initially the 10 elements of agroecology that were advanced by FAO, and then subsequently the HLPE that created the 13 consultative agroecological principles. It is consistent with critical global obligations, for instance, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Declaration of Discrimination Against Women, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other Peoples, the UN drop. So this is something that is not just kind of coming out of some ruminations of smart people sitting in a cigar-filled room, hopefully not, but really is anchored in some of the most critical commitments that embody some of the broad conversations that we've had here around inclusion, looking at minority rights, etc. I think most importantly, it supports the achievement of Agenda 23, an action plan to deliver for people, planet, and prosperity. So I think this is important in addition to what the ambassador said. So this will kind of lead me to the next slide, Fabio, which is, again, there's been a lot of debates and conversations within the Transformative Partnership Platform and the Agroecology Coalition about why we are not focusing as previously envisaged on the 13 principles. But here's what I want to share today, that the policy recommendations of 13 principles are deeply connected. In a sense, they kind of formulate in very interesting 2 dimensions. The first is, if you look at the first 7 principles of the Agroecology Coalition, agroecology that came out of the HLPE, the first 3 policy recommendations kind of fit broadly within that, which is really around resource efficiency, around synergies, and the last 2 are really around securing equity and responsibility. So there is a much kind of broader overarching frame that intersects very deeply with the 13 principles. So it is the convergence, and as I always say, that these 13 principles are great, they're fantastic, I love them, but this is not how you speak to policymakers. You speak to policymakers through policy. All of the issues that Faga's raised, the issues that Jemima raised, the issues that were raised by the ambassador, policy is the currency of transacting commitments, of translating public commitments to attracting investments and to getting resources to bear on these problems. Next slide, Fabio. So the tracking tool comes out of some deep analysis that, of course, was made possible by the CFS recommendations, which was another elaborate, long, arduous process that created 62 specific recommendations that are detailed in the CFS document of 2021, and they define the core areas that best summarize the aims of each of the 5 policy recommendations. So this was another broad elaboration. What we did was then abstract out of that 23 suggestive priority action areas of the 5 policy recommendations. Next slide. And what we've tried to do is to kind of create some priority action areas. And here's an example. So we take, for instance, the CFS policy recommendation number 3, which is fostering the transition to resilient, diversified, sustainable agriculture and food systems through agroecological approaches. And we look at the priority actions across the 25 specific recommendations that came out of the CFS. And what we're trying to do is to create something parsimonious, something that is tractable, something that is deliverable in a short period of time. And what we are seeing here is the focus of those 25 specific recommendations is really on integrated food production systems around crops, fishery, agroforestry, and livestock to enhance biodiversity, around recycling and regeneration of soil health. And these are consistent with the first 7 principles, as I mentioned before, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, that are really kind of embed that policy recommendation inside what is kind of the granular DNA of agroecological principles. So this is kind of like a preface, a preview of the method that we use to make sure that these policy recommendations and the priority actions that we abstract out of that are really strongly anchored in the deep reserves of enormous work that has been done by many people in the past in a strong collective collaborative environment. Next slide, Fabio. So why the CFS policy recommendations? Why are these kind of an important and engaging possibility for us? I think what I want to say is that while agroecological principles and the agroecological approaches are sensible and morally imperative, they're not inevitable. They will not roll on the wheels of inevitability, as a preacher from this country once said many years ago. And the 13 consolidated principles of agroecology are not self-executing. So you need a vehicle. You need some measures within policy, within institutional and bureaucratic apparatus, and across global intergovernmental systems such as the UN, for example, to make this work. And while agroecological principles show promising results, they tend to be under-researched and under-resourced. And we had a lot of conversations around Jemima's intervention, for example, around Ambassador Gabriel Ferrero's conversation, but especially in the low and middle income countries. Professor Ndemo talked about the power symmetries, the enormous stark differences in capabilities in public policy formulation, in research, and all of that. And these are not trivial things, but you need a vehicle around which you can build global and national consensus. The next point is that public policies, whether research and investments, are urgently needed for more sustainable, comprehensive approaches to agroecological interventions. So these, you cannot do this outside this abstraction. It might look generic, and some of the kind of pure zealots of the principles tend to think that this is a very, very weak abstraction. But we believe that there is no other way you can push this if you don't speak the language of policymakers. There's such a thing as a political economy of getting action, and scientists can pride and be exceedingly happy about the granularity of the detail. But I think for me, this is the hard terrain. If we can't walk this hard terrain, then it's not going to work for us. Next slide. So we've abstracted 3 objectives that we think so far from the data that we have seem to be reasonable. And as the ambassador said, the CFS policy recommendations are voluntary. They're not binding, but they're a tool that we're using now to seek to track measures that create perverse incentives within governments to keep business as usual. Of course, there are tremendous lock-in socio-technical that enable that path dependence to continue. We're also looking at measures within government policy apparatus, within plans and strategies that go beyond policy recommendations. So it's not just to create a basis for criticizing government inaction and bureaucratic inertia, but also to create a basis for inclusive, for encouraging conversations that enable governments to keep doing some of the things that they're doing, which are in the right direction. And I think what is important to emphasize here is that governments are not responding to the CFS policy recommendations. We're working with existing policy. So what we are seeing and we're finding with some of this work is really encouraging. The governments autonomously and without necessarily responding to some kind of global dictate, we're already moving in a certain direction as made necessary by the national context to basically produce sufficient food in sustainable ways. And then the next one is an important piece as well, which is civil society perspective on enabling policies. Civil societies and their dimensions in terms of how they understand governments to remain committed to those earlier things, the UN DRAPE, UN DROP, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women, and of course the Delaney process as well. So how do you hold government in check and policies on track? Next slide. So I will present very briefly some results from the Uganda pilot. We've reviewed over 30 strategies and plans and policies and laws in the Constitution, and we examined them specifically to identify which are the perverse incentives in existing legislation as a basis to open the door for opportunities to explore policy change and policy formulation. The next one is to look at the provisions that go currently beyond the CFS policy recommendations and to use that as a path to encourage government to keep going in that direction. The other one is to kind of check back with civil society organizations to understand whether these are reasonably agreeable directions, but also for civil society to come back and say, well, it's just on paper. So it's kind of like the ground truthing, the fidelity test of some of these formulations. Next slide. So in the Uganda pilot, what we've looked at, this is not very clear, but I'll try and walk you through it. And I'll give you the learnings and the lessons that come from that. I think the detail is just to kind of show the method. So we have the policy recommendation on the column on your far left, and then we have the priority actions, and then the current status is in the next column, and then we're looking at we're going to determine during the process what are some of the kind existing obligations. For example, we're going to identify other elements of tracking and indicators around that, and then who's responsible for some of these recommendations going forward. Next slide. So this is the exciting piece, what we're learning in terms of what currently appears as kind of perverse incentives. Every government has a national fertilizer policy that is encouraging the use of organics and biofertilizers by promoting integrated plant and crop nutrient systems that maintain soil fertility, for example. We see this across the Uganda legislation. For example, we have the agriculture sector strategic plan that promotes and investments that will target the improvement of agricultural markets. This is important. We're looking at this through public-private partnerships and investments in fiscal and markets as well. We talked about looking at the food chain, looking at market integration, looking at participation of local communities, looking at making food local and making markets local and work for local communities. In Uganda, for instance, Uganda is most advanced in that part of the world in terms of promoting agroecology. The organic agriculture policy supports farmer associations, and especially including women and youth associations to engage in agro-processing, again, bringing markets closer to the communities. We're also seeing developments and improvement and maintenance of markets and rural access, looking at local energy and water resources to enhance marketing and crops as well. So water is a critical bottleneck in these environments, and we cannot make these full transitions unless we find some reasonable solutions around distributed irrigation systems. And energy is going to be a critical part of that. So energy has to kind of play a much broader overarching role across all of the principles in agroecology as well. We're also looking at development of entrepreneurial skills in agriculture and value chain actors. Jemima talked about reimagining extension services, and extension services has to come further downstream to beyond just growing, but entrepreneurial skills that then create those virtuous value chains that will promote sustainable production, especially development of innovation around inputs. Next slide. So there are certain things that we think are not working properly. An emphasis on priority crops, the kind of big focus on commodities, I think has huge implications on dietary and nutrition diversity at the household level. In Kenya, in Uganda, in Ethiopia, the government is talking about the big commodity priority crops around which they're creating all kinds of hubs and value addition for processing. I think this will diminish some of the goals that we're aiming at. The next one is customary land rights. Jemima talked about women not having the resources to produce. There's still a lot of these kinds of elements in the national legislation in terms of who has access to title, who has access to productive resources, especially land. And women often work the land, but they don't own the land. In fact, the transfer rights and the inheritance rights still favor the male gender in a very significant way, and yet, credit that is collateralized through land then becomes an issue for women to access. The other questions around provision of data and information and extension services are framed in very bureaucratic technical ways. So even though we want to create more of a bottom-up approach, the extension service and the investments around extension service delivery is still very top-down. So where is the co-creation? Where is the valorization of local indigenous technical knowledge in this production system? As Fergus said, this is not an input-intensive system. It is more of a knowledge-intensive system. So if you're foreclosing the opportunity for knowledge to bubble from the top up, by still imposing these very top-down hegemonic processes of knowledge generation, then I think that's a huge problem. While it's laudable that there are conducive policies and legal provisions on a lack provisions, there's a lack of coherence in coordination. So everything exists in Uganda. We looked at 13 pieces of legislation, everything is in there, but it's very difficult to see how it all fits together. Accountability is diffuse, and therefore it's nobody's business at the end of the day when nothing gets done. So that still becomes an issue. So we talk about all of these benign, kind of enabling, very progressive policy formulations within different strategies, policies, laws, and the constitution, but it's difficult to find who we can hold accountable because of the nature of that diffuse process. Next slide. So what is the value of this tool? I think what is important is to create a platform for inclusive dialogue. It is not a gotcha kind of tool to tell government, here's where you're failing, here's where you're floundering, but it recognizes the efforts within the agricultural and food systems transformation, given the very difficult and different national context. What is the starting point for these transitions? And I like Ambassador Gabriel Ferrero's point about, can we create a parallel process for understanding the transition, such as the one that has been created in the energy sector? What are those energy transition pathways that will find different governments and different institutions and different contexts along a path and a continuum to progress? And that we're just making sure that it's progress in the right direction across different transitional opportunities that are enabled under different national contexts. As you can see, these governments are beholden to fertilizer. How do you get them out of that ramp? What is the off-ramp time, and what are those opportunities and investments through policy and institutional innovation that will create a faster off-ramp from this degrading kind of input-based processes? The other one is a tracking tool forms a framework for changing the tenor and the character of interaction between civil society and governments. What we see now is a very adversarial kind of evidence-free engagement, where civil society latches at government and basically doesn't understand the context and the political economy in which governments are operating. So what we're saying here is that with this very transparent analysis of the honest, good effort that governments are already putting in place, you create an opportunity for advocacy and for progressive understanding of investments in policy reforms that are most feasible considering the political and economic context of these countries. So it's basically kind of lowering the temperature and reducing the tensions between civil society and governments. I think that's my last slide. Fabio, thank you very much for moving this along.
Thank you very much, Alex. You've given us lots to contemplate. And while people are thinking about his comments and the tracking tool and its potential, I just want to remind our online participants to use the question and answer function. And we hope to be able to come to some of your questions after we've had some further reflection, time permitting. We'll bring them to the floor. And now I want to turn to Irish Bagalat, who is the Asian Farmers Association representative. We've asked Irish to give some reflection and feedback and also share some initiatives on the ground, especially in terms of farmers, how farmers are engaging in and informing research in the region. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, Irish. Welcome.
Yes, thank you, Rachel, and thank you also, Alex, for sharing the tracking tool. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm connecting from the Philippines, and AFA, we are delighted to be given this opportunity to give our reaction and also share some of the experiences we had on co-innovation and participatory research processes. So I want to give a brief reaction on what was presented by Alex. I think I agree, and he also mentioned that this tracking tool indeed is very important for us constituency-based groups who are advocating for agroecology to use to engage with our governments in constructive dialogue, and even beyond the dialogue, but to actually use the outputs of the tracking tool for joint planning. And I also see that with what was the case that was presented, it can indeed potentially magnify what needs to be changed, and what policies that we can anchor our agroecological work with. And indeed, the tool will be very helpful and useful in the advocacy work of the civil society organization. The analysis done by the team, the streamlining that was done was very much needed to ensure that local organizations and farmers organizations like us can also use it, although I'm sure that it can still be further adapted, so that it's appropriate to the capacity of local organizations and community-based organizations. And now I think what's important is on how the tool can be used and disseminated, especially to existing multi-stakeholder platforms. For example, in Asia, there are existing family farming committees in several countries who are engaging with governments through regular annual policy dialogue. So it's I think a question and an offer also for the team, being in partnership with FAO in facilitating the family farming platform in Asia. We can help in the dissemination and pilot testing in our region. So now on the farmers' engagement in research agenda setting and research activities within our network, we have 20 members who are national farmers organization and cooperatives in 16 countries. What we have seen so far is that farmers' participation in research is more apparent in Southeast Asia than in other sub-regions in Asia, and that most of the institutions who have been engaging in participatory action research with farmers or farmer-driven research are mostly NGOs and a few academic institutions. And I think it's common knowledge that barriers for transformative research and co-innovation are actually present at different levels. So programs and agenda of many governments hasn't changed at all, still focusing on a number of commodities, and that there is also the lack of institutional capacities of research institutions, research centers, and also individual capacities, both at the researcher level and also at the farmer level to really, collaborate, and engage with each other on co-creation. And also we know for a fact that there is the existence of powerful lobbying groups that are influencing the programs and the agendas of the government. And of course, the adequate financial resources for researchers to do co-innovation is also not there yet. Financing, not just for researchers, but also for farmers, to do farmer-driven or farmer-led research in their farms. And to foster co-innovation and transformative research, it's important for our governments, for research institutions, and other mainstream actors to really acknowledge and valorize our knowledge and experience as experts in our own fields and farm, and recognize and accept, as stated by Fergus, that the realities on the ground differ from one locality to the other, and also for enablers and actors to have a thorough understanding of our realities, and that recognize the solutions that we have already developed over the years, and also acknowledge that there are actually existing resources to build on. And also important to enable greater integration and inclusion of women and young farmers, and consider farmers' organizations like AFA as equal partners in research rather than beneficiaries and targets. And on a more, this is my last few statements, on a more practical level, I think it's important to create space an interface between farmers and researchers. For example, we have been engaged through the GFAR's Collective Action on Forgotten Food. So they have used, they have used forgotten foods because it's the farmers who are the holders of knowledge on the neglected, underutilized crops. They have used this as an interface where actually farmers and researchers can work together. So I think such creative interfaces should be, replicated and multiplied so that there is the opportunity for researchers to acknowledge the knowledge that the farmers hold. And for us, we have been enabled also through this GFAR collective action to do our own surveys and consultations with our members and farmers, and they have really given us the financial resources to be able to do all these surveys and consultations in several localities. So for us, we have seen that there are institutions who are really ready to collaborate with farmers' organization. There are institutions who are willing to share resources for co-innovation, and I think this is very important, and it's also important for research institutions and centers to revisit their approaches, their objectives, and their mission. And transforming our food system also means transforming partnership. And I think unless we transform the kind of partnership that we do, then it would be difficult to really to implement the concept of co-creation and co-innovation. So I will stop there. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irish. That's lots of information and ideas for us to chew on. And in the spirit of an agroecological approach, we want to open up the discussion to those in the room and also those online. We want to spend a few minutes discussing in small groups a question. So for that, I want you to look at your table for those of you in the room, and online. Fabio will handle that. And for those of you in the room, identify a facilitator and a rapporteur. And we hope that you'll share a key message from your group at the end of this brief discussion. The question that we are hoping you will discuss, and keeping in mind what both Alex and Irish have reflected on in the last few minutes, is it more effective to develop specific agroecology policies? So a national agroecology policy, or organize across government agencies to have policies to deliver agroecological outcomes. So this is a key practical question that governments are grappling with. And I shouldn't just say national, because we know, of course, that at the provincial or state level and municipal level, there are agroecology policies or efforts to have agroecological outcomes. So if you could spend a few minutes discussing, is it more effective to develop specific agroecology policies or organize across government agencies to have policies that deliver agroecology outcomes? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. And so right now, what I would ask the tech team to do is to take away my audio in the room. So please remove the PA, and I will guide our audience in Zoom into the way we will tackle this question. So basically, what I'd like to do is I'd like you to join a Jamboard, and to do so, I will share the link on the chat, and also put a QR code. And if you want to join with a mobile device. Now the Jamboard is it goes through a Google Doc, so you will need a Google app. If you don't have it downloaded, please. It takes just a minute, or if you do it with a mobile. But if you join via a browser, it will work automatically. You don't need to download anything. So on the chat, I just put the link. I'm going to share my screen very quickly so that you can look at the QR code. If you want to go with a mobile phone or a with a mobile device. So this is the QR code. You have the chat. You have the link in the chat. So please join us. Once you're there, I'm going to now share the screen and show you the Jamboard, how it works and what we're going to do. So allow me just a second to pull it up. Here it is. Okay. All right. So this is the Jamboard. I hope you can all see it. And what we're discussing now is which specific policies should be developed to scale up agroecology, and also what actions across government agencies would conduce to the most efficient agroecology outcomes. So everybody who joins this Jamboard can edit, but the only thing I would like you to do is really to use this tool here, which is a sticky note. You can see it if you're looking at my screen. Just click on the sticky note and put what policies, for example, I don't know, incentives. You just write it down and you save it, and you can click outside and you can locate it where you want. I'm going to be moderating this this Jamboard, so making space if it gets crowded, and ensuring that everything is working smoothly. Okay, so I already see somebody putting crop diversity. Thank you very much. And so you can focus on the policies or really actions across government agencies. So we have 20, almost 30 people in the Jamboard. Feel free to play around with it. Yeah, I can see somebody's playing around with with a pen. Try to avoid the pen because it just becomes a bit messier. Just use the sticky notes if possible. Okay, so I'll stop sharing my screen at the moment, but I'll keep on looking at this, and I'll check in the Q&A. If you have any questions, you just put them in the Q&A. Okay, I can see people are populating this board very well. Thank you very much. I think I can see funds and technology and training. That's very good. Capacity development, of course. I see that we have 2 incentives. I think we can take one out. One was mine. It was just a test. Enhanced cross-sectoral, cross-ministerial collaboration and policy formulation. Very good. Oh, removing harmful subsidies for fertilizers. Yeah, that's a very important point. Making it a level playing field so that we can actually see the importance of natural practices and the fact that they are less costly. Oh, I say somebody moved the thing around. No problem, I can fix that. Okay. Yes, I see a lot of very interesting items. I'm going to just remove the doubles. I see 2 crop diversity. I think maybe we can just remove 1. Creating exchange spaces for local actors to co-create knowledge and agroecological. I totally agree. With the TPP, we have a digital community of practice to exchange knowledge and co-create knowledge. We have also a number of very interesting innovations. We have the citizen science map, so a map that you can crowdsource with your agroecological practices. You can learn about what people are doing. You can book a session with scientists from our partners. You can request a workshop. There's a lot of things you can do. So I do encourage everyone, if you haven't been on the Agroecology TPP website, to join us. Yeah, very interesting. Utilize change agents. That's interesting. One would have to define the change agents. But yeah, definitely behavioral change is something very important. Okay, let's move. Access to land. Access to land. That's a very common battle, one that is very important. Ownership of land, access to land. Okay, I'm gonna have to move things around here because it's getting crowded. Very good. Thank you so much for putting all these comments. I think the people in New York are gonna be very interested in all of this. Yes, clearly policies to support women and youth and really engaging in agroecology. Carbon price, that's interesting. Land zoning for agriculture, oh, that would be very good. I don't know if that's happening already in some areas. Okay, it's getting quite crowded. Let me remove the empty ones. Yeah, thanks for those who are also making an effort to move things so that they're legible. And yeah, I think we can make smaller some of the ones that, oh, don't move the question, please. I know these are just errors, I understand. Okay. Bio inputs production, okay. Wow. Develop harmonized standards. That's a very important point. We're working on holistic metrics to do exactly that. Well, not as standards, but at least to have correct metrics for measurements in agroecology. Discourage chemical approaches with strict laws. I think this should go here. I'm going to move it to the policies part. Launch campaigns, yeah, that goes again with the behavioral change ideas. Appreciate and include indigenous voice. That's absolutely fundamental for traditions, for land ownership, for knowledge, for inclusion. I think that's fundamental. Generate impact credits based on practices implemented. Yeah, absolutely. There's a big discussion also on biodiversity credits right now. Microbiology as a regenerative agent, oh, clearly that's absolutely fundamental for agroecology. Oh, we have. Wow, thank you very much, everybody. This is absolutely fantastic. Subsidized transitions toward more autonomous systems. Yeah, clearly. I think the question of incentives remains critical for making agroecology, putting it on the same level of sort of, let's call it, the current agricultural paradigms, which are often subsidized. Stronger policy recommendations from government, yeah. Mexico, we have a program for agroecology transition called the Producción para el Bienestar with almost, yeah, well, Mexico is on the forefront on agroecology, we know, and we do a lot in Latin America. So yeah, that's absolutely fundamental, and we should learn from best practices like this. Farmer seeds, right? Yeah, that's very important and long discussion ongoing, and absolutely agreed. Social security for farm workers, yeah, for farmers, yeah, absolutely. Social security should be there for everybody, but even more so for the weakest sectors of society, and farmers are clearly one of them. I have some sticky notes which I can't see, I'm gonna move this here. Wow. Oh, there's stuff. Oh, sorry. I think I moved something while somebody else was moving it. Apologies. I think this Jamboard is going to go straight into the proceedings of this event, and we're going to make a list of all of this. Thank you so much. Rural women production. Yeah, well, rural women do most of the production, in fact. Yay. Oh, sorry. Not too small. A bit bigger. Have some space here. Okay, whoever wrote ban CAFOs, can you spell out what CAFO stands for? I myself, I'm not sure. I would know. Can you can edit if you go on, if you click on it, then you it appears on the right upper corner, 3 dots, and it says edit, and you can edit. Sorry, just so that everybody understands. Recognition and implementation of UNDROP by governments. Certification, market-oriented policies. In both post-harvest downstream actors in promoting agroecological produce. Absolutely, I think the changing the food systems requires the whole chain, every actor to be involved. It's not just the production. Ensure secure land tenure rights. Yes, of course, this is absolutely critical. Okay, thanks. Thank you for having spelled that out so I can see. Yes, ban concentrated agricultural feeding operations. Okay, I was not aware that CAFOs meant this thing. Absolutely. Banning is always controversial, but yeah, definitely reducing. What do we have here? Land zoning, we had already seen. Research and innovation on local proven agroecological. Yeah, I totally agree. The agroecology TPP was born to do this and is working on research in agroecology. So backing up statements with facts and numbers and data science. So absolutely. Food sovereignty should be the overarching framework for achieved through agroecology. Food sovereignty should be it's a pillar of society. It should be guaranteed for everyone, and especially the weakest sector of society, and looking at traditions and indigenous people. Cross dialogue south, north, south to seek synergy. Yes, absolutely. Promote an agroecology. Agroecology as an investment, not as an expense. That's interesting. I wonder, I had never seen agroecology as an expense, but maybe it's because I'm too pro agroecology, and so I have a biased vision. But I see the point. This is interesting, actually, how some governments or some actors might actually see agroecology as an expense, and it's actually not true. So I totally agree with this statement. Making farming more lucrative, farm size restriction and increased farmers. Okay, those are two things which I'm not sure they actually go. I mean, yeah, they could go together if you have laws. But it's interesting how you would have, if it becomes more lucrative, you would have farmers trying to increase farm size. So you have to regulate that. But yeah, definitely farming should be more lucrative. It is a problem that farmers are often the poorest or one of the poorest sectors of society. It also talks to the youth. If farming becomes more lucrative, then it will attract more youth, and which is another issue that is currently on the table. What else? And if I miss your sticky note, I'm just trying to wrap my head around all of these incredible inputs. So apologies if I'm not seeing your input, but don't make it too big because you're going to cover the other inputs. So I'm going to make this one smaller again. But some are just under others. And so as I told you, what we'll do after the event is we're going to go through one by one, make a list of all of these, and then make it available with the proceedings, with the recording, with the there's going to be a blog also, and yeah, and the PowerPoints, I guess, also. So rethink some global policies that lock food system in its current structure in order to relocalize food production for territorial market and food security first before export crops. Okay, so here we're talking really about globalization and global trade and import-export, and yeah, talks also about food sovereignty and food security first. And I agree that, yeah, this is a very interesting comment. It's also a very complicated thing to do when you go global, but definitely food security should be put first, and then all the rest. And agroecology can definitely help on this, both with the local angle, but also increasing food security for our population. Invest in agriculture and research. Okay, we discussed this. This is very small. What happened here? Capacity building grassroots farmers on the continual use of organic and okay.
That works.
I hear...
Welcome back. Oh, sorry for the loud noise. Okay, in-person group, if you can come back to the, thank you. So I would like to ask whether each group in the room could just summarize very quickly some key ideas that you had at your table. And I'm going to start at the far left table. Do they have a microphone back there?
Thank you very much, Sandy Hecker. I'm with two NGOs, but today it's with the Association to Lead Women Advancement in Nepal and the farming that we do there. We brought up today, however, I'm going to backtrack on this. I've been involved with oceans, water, climate change at the United Nations. I have attended a lot of meetings. What has been critical, which I brought up to them in the past few months, everything that you're doing here cannot be done without clean water. One of the meetings that I sat on has to do with China, Kyrgyzstan, Nepal, and other countries on the 5-year plan. China's 2/3 mountains. They're losing because of climate change. Fresh water is not there. Their people in the mountain region can be starving. Nepal brought that up. Italy was brought up. Alps are melting and their crops are being flooded. There will be an economic crisis in Italy. Now, I attended meetings with the Law of the Sea, the mining I've been part of, and other things. What is critical is, with climate change, is the loss of fresh water. Some people brought up, well, you have the ice from up north or down south. No, because the water is not fresh and it's poison. We are losing. You cannot have, and the African members of the African Union attended a lot of these meetings. You cannot have what you're talking about without fresh water. And this is what ocean and, oh, the coral reefs, Australia was there.
Okay, thank you. And I think agroecological principles really focus on agricultural practices that ensure clean water and also ensure recycling. So I think that's an important point, and one that's even more crucial in light of climate change impacts. What about the table over here? Do you have a synthesis recommendation or idea to bring forward?
Hi, I'm not sure if we have a synthesis, but we had a really great discussion around what different options would look like. And some of the questions that were raised were around the kind of pace of change that is needed, and how we can ensure that looking at both kind of cross governmental interventions as well as through specific national plans, and how perhaps they can all work together in terms of ensuring that we're able to have the pace of change that is needed, that is also equitable and allows for participation and representation from marginalized farmers, going back to the points that Irish had shared earlier, and also looking at how we can ensure effective private participation within that, and ensure that governments aren't just working within silos, not just at a national, regional, and local level, but also at an internationally regional level. So we're actually able to bring in a very multifaceted, multi-level, and kind of multi-stakeholder approach to agroecology, so that it's centered in how we're addressing the kinds of change that we need. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the pace of change is crucial, and working across agencies is important. Thanks for those thoughts. Maybe this table over here, just a brief summary of a key idea or recommendation you came up with.
Thank you. Yes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rodrigo. I'm from the Permanent Mission of Brazil here. So we have a diverse composition in our table, but I think we had a very consensual discussion, mostly focused on the institutional arrangements needed for promoting a coherent approach to agroecology. I think the first takeaway from the group is that as a field that encompasses many areas such as environment, agriculture, but also the social outcomes needed for agroecology to thrive, we are discussing how a cross-cutting issue is needed that brings together different actors in the government structure, but at the same time also having dedicated knowledge and dedicated attention to production approaches, etc. The second takeaway, I think, it's the need, as the other table already mentioned, to build some sort of institutional multi-stakeholder approach, so we can have the producers and the indigenous people and the local communities also having an institutional space to express themselves, and for the government to hear their demands when designing policies that truly addresses their needs to promote agroecology. And within this multi-stakeholder discussion, we also talked about the need to have a special attention to the food systems of indigenous peoples, which in many times for centuries have been embracing concepts that are very similar to agroecology, that has this organic approach to agriculture, and that was for long not recognized as such, and now it's actually the science that is taking on the knowledge, the traditional knowledge of them. Our colleague here was just telling us that in Hindu scriptures, for example, there was prescriptions on how to produce ecologically, etc., for centuries. So that's something that's important to not only recognize, but also to recover and to bring into policy design. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a rich discussion, Your Excellency. And not only in terms of the approach, inclusive, multi-stakeholder, but also close attention to drawing from Indigenous knowledge in kind of forefronting that and in that approach. This table over here, any reflections?
So I think a lot of good points were already mentioned. I'm not going to repeat those again, but I think our main discussion focused around the private sector, like someone mentioned already in the chat, because inevitably there's different levels, and you can only in practice have what people want and need if all parts of the hierarchy understand what those needs are. So policymakers, stakeholders, and also companies, how the pay is chosen also for farmers who are the most affected, and just boost development in those areas as well. It goes hand in hand with SDGs. So I think that's the main point we talked about, the private sector and just hearing more about that.
Okay, thank you. That's an important point that's been raised. What about our front tables? What thoughts do you bring?
Good noon. Our group is composed of Patrick, Mary, Alex, and our moderator, Oliver. So we have quite a good discussion, and we come up to exchanges in realities in the field. That first, with all good intent, the government is a bureaucracy, and things are slow in a bureaucracy. Second, non-government organizations who are, let's say, on the a balancer in this movement is also experiencing a funding drought, and so it limits capacities and movement of NGOs. And so in this scenario, we are left with local civil society organization. When I'm saying local, is the grassroots level civil society organizations, a resource that has not been tapped. Who are they? They may be the village peddlers. They may be the mom and pop shops. And they are the farmers doing farming. And they may be indigenous farmers also there. And what Eric Alex has shared is like really huge, 13 policy recommendations, principles. It's technocratic, it's very bureaucratic, it's high science, and these things is hardly digestible at the grassroots level. And so we were moving forward our discussion to what about recommending to mainstream a policy advocacy program that capacitate and output village legislations that integrates agroecological frameworks to farming and food systems at the grassroots and local level. Because things are happening in the UN level, at FAO level, and the scientific community level. But things in parallel to that should be moving downstream. And so if we will capacitate this village, legitimize sometimes culture, because sometimes culture, if not proven by science, is taken as hearsay. But now we found out with agroecology that the unscientific is, after all, scientific. And so if you would like to make this movement, both at the top level, at the grassroots level, we should have these village level legislations that supports where mom and pop shops, where farmers can identify and understand and digest. And so relationships at the local level implementing or adapting agroecological principles will get legitimized, and people would know, aha, we are part of a bigger picture.
Thank you. That's an exciting idea, village level policy advocacy program.
And it works. We have experience that it works.
I believe you. Working with farmers in Malawi, farmer research teams at the village level, I know that can be a powerful mechanism. So I believe you. Over to the last table.
Okay, so maybe I should just stand up because it's look great. So my name is Lisa. I work at the French Permanent Mission. It's very a pleasure to be here. Just to not repeat what's been said, what we have been talking is it's about the key issue is the coordination. We say between like at the national level between minister is true, but we will have also local and regional. And I think this is one of the key issue, but also we have been talking about good practices because ministers are changing. Like there are associations that's moving on too. So that's one of the ideas. And then about the awareness, to be frank, I'm based in New York. And before this meeting, I think most of my colleagues haven't heard about agroecology. So that's what does that mean? It means that it's well known in Roma because it's food system UN agencies. But here in New York, there is something missing. So maybe one of the ideas is to scale up and to use event as my ambassador say, key moment like the UNGA. We are basically right now with the UNGA. So this is a moment that could be also the COP28 with the climate issue. And I'm glad that you hear that you have that in mind. The IFAD, as my ambassador say, and I was thinking also about the LDC conference. LDC seeds. I don't know if you're well familiar with these acronyms, but I think it's important because, for instance, in Africa, they've done a lot. And they talk about agroecology. Senegal talk always about agroecology during this conference. And I think maybe we should mobilize and try to talk more about this issue and create an organized event. And then last but not least, the Secretary General just talk about the Summit of the Future for next year. I think here too, there is an issue. I know I've been too long, but if we can submit our idea would be to try to do something here in New York with member states, maybe organize a meeting together, like with the member of the coalition, just to continue the work that you're doing in Roma, but also everywhere. And so like that, we can promote that. Thank you very much.
Merci. Some concrete recommendations for further action. Fabio, can you raise some of the questions that the online group has done?
Yeah, sorry. Not sure I can raise questions because our online participants cannot speak. This is a webinar. So what we organized is actually, well, they can pose their questions in the question and answer box in Zoom, but we organized actually a Jamboard, and I can show you the Jamboard. I can share my screen quickly.
Sure.
You can see the depth of the inputs that they have provided. I can't really go through it. I was commenting the inputs one by one as they were coming in, but they were so fast. We have, I think, around 50 or 60. But what we did is we divided the Jamboard in two halves. One was really if they could identify specific policies for scaling up agroecology, and the other was more about collaboration and actions across government agencies that could conduce to more efficient agroecological outcomes. And you, just by looking at this, you can see there's been a lot of thought. There's a lot of discussions about incentives and trying to level the field for agroecology, banning of fertilizers, but also land tenure rights, and a lot about capacity building, starting in education from very early. And so there's a lot of food for thought. So what I suggest we do, us as organizers of this meeting, is that we take all these inputs and we list them in a file, and then we sort of analyze them and send them back to all the participants of this meeting so that everybody can have a look at this, maybe with a reflection around these inputs. That's all for me. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Fabio. And that looks like a very rich set of recommendations and ideas from our online participants. So that's delightful, and we'll look forward to digging into them in depth. So with that, I would like to thank the active participation of both online and in-person members of this session. And I'm formally closing it and opening session 3. So that's the end of session 2. And now we're moving to session 3, which is going to really tackle the SDGs. How can we do them together? How can we achieve them together? And how to do this really practically in practice. So we want to talk about what is not working in terms of achieving the SDGs and efforts to combine indicators to arrive at holistic metrics of agriculture and food system performance that addresses both the equity questions that have been raised earlier, as well as multifunctionality of agriculture and the central role of food systems for sustainable development more broadly. And so with that brief introduction for this session, I want to call on Mary Crossland, who is with the C4 and ICRAF, the Center for Forestry Research, International Center for Forestry Research and Agroforestry. And Mary is going to give us a talk about measuring what matters, guiding principles for the holistic assessment of agri-food systems. She's a livelihood systems associate scientist at C4 and ICRAF. Thanks, Mary.
Great, okay. So I'll be talking about holistic assessment of agri-food systems and proposing some guiding principles for how we can design more equitable and holistic evaluations. And I'll be drawing on some work that's being funded by, is EC-IFAD funded, a project called Metrics. And this really reflects the efforts of a much wider team. Some of you who I hope are joining online are in the room today. So next slide, Fabio. So we've heard one of the key challenges to upscaling agroecology is being able to provide policymakers, donors, development actors and farmers with ways of measuring performance that allow for the fair comparison with alternatives. And given the complexity of agri-food systems, measuring them isn't very easy. And common practice has been to measure a narrow set of metrics, often focusing on productivity and economic performance. Yet agroecological systems provide environmental and social benefits, not just economic ones. So assessing them just in terms of production and economic benefits misses the whole point of agroecology. Likewise, assessing conventional systems without including those longer-term impacts on social and environmental dimensions can lead to their degradation. So what we need is ways to measure performance of different approaches holistically and to compare them on a level playing field. Okay, next slide. So we've been conducting a systematic review of over 200 assessments. And from this work, we've identified 4 key ingredients for holistic assessment. So first, they need to be multi-dimensional. They need to assess at least some economic, social, and environmental aspects. They need to include multiple perspectives. Third, they need to capture emergent properties of the system. And lastly, they need to reveal complexity, nuance, and trade-offs. So how did the 200 plus assessments hold up against these 4 ingredients, or rather principles for holistic assessment? Okay, next slide. Number 1, measure multiple dimensions. While all of the assessments we reviewed did tick this box, we see a large diversity of the dimensions that are addressed. And to help identify some of the overlooked dimensions, we mapped each assessment to the SDGs to which they address. And unsurprisingly, we see that goals directly related to food production are more frequently addressed than, say, those related to more socially related goals, such as governance, equity, and gender equality. And as we've already heard, these aspects are things that agroecology can deliver very strongly on and that need to be evaluated if we're to have that level playing field. And we also see that most assessments focus at the farm level rather than those higher levels such as food systems. Okay, next slide. So number 2, include multiple perspectives. So different actors are going to have different understandings of performance, and these need to be included. So co-designing assessments with multiple stakeholders can really help increase the relevance and utility of assessments and those outcomes. Yet what we see is that assessments rarely involve stakeholders from the start. Instead, we see that they tend to elicit feedback once the goal and what's going to be measured has already been decided. So it's more getting feedback on the functionality and usability of assessments and approaches. Okay, next slide. So number 3, capturing emergent properties. And so emergent properties such as resilience, circularity, empowerment, and equity, they arise from the complex interactions amongst components within a system. And although there's some measures that have been developed for some of these properties, they can be very difficult to measure directly. Instead, what we might need to use are process-based metrics to infer performance. And these might include indicators such as capturing farmers' engagement with those promoting change. For example, the proportion of women participating in innovation platforms, and what changes are being promoted, and also changes in people's attitudes. So we heard from Jemima about data they'd collected on attitudes around gender. And these process-based indicators can also allow us to track outcomes that are very slow to change. And so through using process-based indicators, we can improve the chance that data influences actions. Okay, number 4. Sorry, next slide. So lastly, employing metrics in ways that reveal complexity. So only 24% of the over 200 assessments considered interactions amongst metrics, and most only evaluated performance at a single point in time. Many also relied on composite indices and radar plots like this one on the slide. And while these are very attractive and simple, they tend to hide complexity and overlook potential trade-offs and synergies. So one option for exploring interactions is to actually plot multiple metrics against each other and then to view how the data changes over time. So something that we've been working on with Stats for SD, our partners, is an online platform for exploring relationships across multiple sustainable development goals. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to show you one example. On the x-axis, we're going to have change in goal 15, life on land. On the y-axis, we're going to have change in goal 2, no hunger. And there's going to be small bubbles that represent countries. The color denotes the region. And what we'll see is the trace, or the lines, will show us the trajectory of each country. And the smiley faces here are just to orientate us into which quadrant we should be aiming for. All right, so Fabio, if you can hit play. We can see that some countries, as time progresses, are zooming ahead, progressing on both goals, while some are maybe falling behind and some may be lagging in progress. We can also see there's quite a few jumps in these traces, and that probably indicates lack of data. Okay, next slide. And this is just kind of pointing out some of those countries that have made progress on both of those indicators. Okay, next slide. And that was quite a complex picture we were looking at. So if we zoom into 2 regions, we can see some quite distinct trends. For many sub-Saharan African countries, we see decreased hunger, but also increased land degradation. So what could be driving this? Does this reflect a potential trade-off between these goals? Or could it be driven by agricultural extensification? And is there a role for agroecology in really enabling progress on both of these fronts? In contrast, we can see for some of these EU countries, we see large gains in Goal 15, life on land, but we also see some negative trends around Goal 2, no hunger. So potentially reflecting kind of recent shocks such as COVID, Ukraine, or a reliance on imports. Okay, next slide. We can also look for goals where we're moving in the right direction on both fronts. So here we have the ratio of female to male years in education on the x-axis, and then the prevalence of undernourishment on the y-axis. Okay, so if you hit play, Fabio. And again, so over time, we can see that many countries are making progress on both of these metrics. And we also know that there's research to support this relationship between Goal 5, gender equality, and also Goal 2, no hunger. Okay, next slide. But we can also see more recently this kind of increase in malnutrition for some countries, shown by this kind of kick up in the trace. So maybe we need to think about what's going on there. What are the reasons and drivers for these changes in trajectory? Okay, next slide. So hopefully these have given you an idea about how we can look at SDG data differently. I've only looked at 2 goals at a time, but the platform that is being developed can actually allow you to look up to 7 dimensions at once. So really dig into that complexity. Okay, so in summary, to really upscale agroecology, we need to create that level playing field. And this starts with holistic assessment. And to do this, we need assessments that measure multiple dimensions, include diverse perspectives, capture emergent properties of the system, including equity, and that use metrics and present data in ways that reveal complexity, nuance, and trade-offs so that they can be understood and taken into account when designing solutions. The platform that we're developing, it's still a prototype, so please bear that in mind when testing and using it, but you can find it here through this QR code and web address. And these kind of 4 principles that I've been talking to today, they're in no way exhaustive, but I hope they've got you thinking about how we can improve the way that we evaluate food and agricultural systems. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Lots to think about and some interesting, intriguing, exciting examples that you've put forward here. And with that, I would like to now turn to an online participant, the director of Caring for the Earth Porticus Foundation, Mariana Wączewski, who is going to reflect on Mary's presentation and think about these dimensions of assessment that Mary put forward, as well as examples and lessons from the work that she's involved in seeking out and supporting innovation. So over to you, Mariana.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Mary. I hope you guys can hear me there in New York. I'm speaking today from the Netherlands. So thank you for all these great insights. It's been an amazing 3 hours, I have to say. So thank you for the organizers for bringing such a great bunch of people together. I would like to start this by pausing and saying that we've come so far. And I think it is really important that we acknowledge it. You know, the first time I actually came across or came in touch with agroecology, I was still an agronomy student back in Brazil at the end of the 90s. And back then it was not just alternative. It was like beyond alternative. It was, you know, we were not taught on agroecology. You could barely read anything on agroecology, Altieri aside, back in the 90s. It was the only thing you could actually do was seeing it on the ground. And when you did, I think it really change the way you understood agriculture and you practice as an individual and as a professional. I know certainly it did to me. So we came really a long way. It's over 25 years later, and here you are sitting in New York, not in Rome, as has been mentioned several times. Rome was relatively difficult to reach too, but New York is yet a different standard. We have an FAO-supported TPP. We have the Agroecological Coalition. We have this table in New York today with plenty of researchers, petitioners, diplomats. Agroecology made it into formal agreements, sometimes still between brackets, but we are getting there. Even though we all know it plays such a fundamental role in our quest for food security, for climate adaptation and mitigation, for gender equality, for rural development, we also know we have a very long way to go. There is plenty of ingrained assumptions still to change. There is plenty of policies to influence. There is really a lot of work to do, and I am not afraid that any of us who works with agroecology in this room will be out of a job anytime soon or at time in the next 20 years. And that's, I think, where Mary's work and that of others who have presented here today on measuring is so fundamental. Because I think we need to be frank, we haven't done a great job over the last 25 years in measuring, in communicating what we've achieved and what the practices on the ground have seen. So I actually would like to add to Mary's point later, because I fully agree with what she presented. So in addition to what she said, I would like to add a number of challenges that I see when we measure and when it communicates results. So I would just like to make 3 points. The first one is that we need to be able to understand complexity, but yet communicate it in a simple way. And I think Alex, has mentioned that previously today. If we fail to do that, we just not understood. And then we do not manage to touch hearts and minds alike. So communicating in a simple way, we are a bit obsessed because it is complex and agroecology is so just the emerging properties of it. It's part of what it is. And yet we have to learn to communicate simply. The second point, we need to engage in policymaking. And Alex again had made a very strong point of that. We need to stop fearing that engagement with policymaking. And it's great. We have so many diplomats in the room that can help us with that. We need to support farmers and others to tell their story, to explain the numbers. We need to educate parliamentarians, congressmen and women, but also, indeed, as a group just said, local policymakers. There's so much to gain from district level policymaking, from municipal level policymaking, from state level policymaking when the federal government doesn't want necessarily to move. And the third
seem
point,
to have lost. Oh, you're back.
I'm back. Sorry. What did you lose me?
Local policymakers.
Local policymakers. That was the last point anyway. And the third point I want to make was on the importance of properly funding research. I have a good old friend that has worked in agroecology many years, is Pablo Titonel, and he once told me that research investment gap between organic, not even agroecology, and conventional agriculture is probably around 90 to 95%. So when you talk about the politics of knowledge, when you talk about understanding complexity, this means a serious relocation of research and development resources, not only to researchers, but also to practitioners and farmers to jointly understand, what works, where, why, and under what conditions. So I think these 3 points are extremely important. Understanding complexity and conveying it simply, the importance to stop fearing engagement with policymaking and yet politics, and the properly fund research. So thank you. Back to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Mariana. Very useful insights, and I think inspiring us to by reminding us how far we've come. That's important to remember as well, and how much more there is to do in complex, but in clearly explained, simple ways. So I want us to have a bit more time talking about, not just I, but our organizers want to have a bit more time in small group discussion. The intent is to spend less time in small groups, and then we will have opportunity to come together for the final part of the session. And so for this small group discussion in person and on the Jamboard, we want you to discuss to what extent do the use of process indicators help us to progress towards more equitable food systems. Again, if you can have a rapporteur that writes down some of your key ideas from your discussion, and we won't be doing reporting back this time, but we will be collecting your responses for the organizers to reflect. So if you can talk about to what extent do the use of process indicators help us to progress towards more equitable food systems? See you in 10 minutes.
Okay, for people in Zoom, I just put the link to the Jamboard. So let's all meet on the Jamboard. And for you in New York, you can mute me again so I don't disturb you. And I'll be facilitating this Jamboard session. I'm also going to share my screen. So if you want to join via mobile, you can do that by scanning this QR code. So I assume you're joining the Jamboard now. I'm also going to share my screen with the Jamboard, but this time I don't need to train you because you're all trained very well. And let's go to the Jamboard. Okay. Here it is. All right. Okay, so I can see already people putting their comments. So the question is, do you think that process indicators help us to progress towards more equitable food systems? And on the left, we have the yes. So if you do think so, you're going to put your sticky note on the left. And if you don't think so, you're going to put it on the right. But what we want is the reason for your answer. Why do you think they do, or why do you think they don't? So we've heard Mary talk about metrics and the importance of correctly measuring and analyzing data with taking into consideration externalities and other factors. So I sort of assume that we will have a majority of replies on the left after such an engaging presentation. But it would be interesting also to put on the right maybe some critical aspects of indicators. So if you have anything in mind, you might still agree that process indicators are a tool, a positive tool that can help us make progress, but you might want to also identify some critical aspects. So let me see what's already on the Jamboard. Okay, so we have easier to measure, so we can get started sooner. Okay, yeah, absolutely. That's one of the goals of having holistic and proper metrics, so that and also easily accessible, so that with data you can take better decisions and faster. More easily, apologies, more easily disaggregated into different social groups. Okay, yes, absolutely. To understand data has really to be disaggregated. Otherwise, you will not go deep into society's issues. You will just have a bulk picture. But we are all diverse. Context is very important. Age, gender, orientations, everything is makes a difference. We can't all be treated the same way. Data, if you can't do this with data, it's all just the same numbers. Yes, what we measure to a large degree determines what we do. Yes, this is what Mary Crossland just said at the end of her presentation. I totally agree. I think there's also an interesting aspect to this idea. What we measure is determines what we do, but not always what we do we're able to measure. And so there's part of uncertainty there, and that's why we need to really improve in measuring things. I also think there's I heard at some point somebody was talking about how agroecology and science, it was not even considered science, and now with data and scientific research, now it sort of becomes more credible. I think an important aspect of this is really that sometimes knowledge is not understanding. So you know how to do something, but you don't understand how that works. So that's why data is important, because it works. And so that can be the case with many traditions. They're completely valid, but then what's the mechanic behind it? And that's why really I think the scientific aspect or the research aspect is very important. Okay, I see something on the left also coming up. So process does not lead to outcome impact if the theory of change is not right. That's totally correct. I'm totally into this statement. I think it's absolutely spot on. Your theory of change has to be right. And many times, unfortunately, there are theories of changes which are proved wrong afterwards. So with the counterfactual. So yeah, we have to work on process, but we have to get the ideas right. Help maybe, but transformative action is needed, and this requires a dramatic mind shift. And addressing vested interests and power imbalances, just measuring is not enough. Okay, yes, absolutely. This ties into the Jamboard we were looking at before, really to engage with policy and trying to address inequalities and power relationships. I think the struggle between research and vested interests is concrete and has been part of our world for a long time. So this is a very good point. Process can, however, help, in my opinion, can however help streamline certain things and make things more evident, and that can help change. It is not change per se, but it can help change. It depends on what kind of indicators we are assessing. Are we involving all stakeholders in designing these metrics? Okay, well, I can talk to this a bit. As part of the TPP, we are working in a larger project, which is called Transitions. And the metrics that Mary has presented is coming from this, a part of that project, a line of research in that project. The other lines of research in that project are digital tools and incentives and investments between and in collaboration between private sector and the public sector. So also looking at multi-stakeholder platforms, absolutely fundamental. All of these things have to go together, otherwise scaling is absolutely impossible. Process indicators less flexible than results-based planning. So risk being less responsive to changing ecopolitical context. Okay, this is a very, how can I say, a very precise comment, a very informed comment. I'm not an expert in indicators, so I can't really respond to this, but definitely something that I'll bring up to the researchers working on this. There's a comment in the middle, which is big, so I wonder.
Okay, we were going to ask you to finish your conversations amongst each other.
I'm going to stop talking here as well. I was curious about this one. World is a bit connected unless developed world can contribute huge.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Very interesting.
Thank you very much for your attention. And I want to thank you for your active participation. It's wonderful to see great conversations happening around agroecology. But with that, I want to thank you for a very lively session. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Oliver Oliveras.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And again, thanks for the very lively conversations we're having here in the room, and also to our friends there online. I see that we have around close to 100 online participants. So thanks for that. Please make sure you hand over to us your bullet points. It's really important that we collect them and reflect on those ideas. We want to make sure that on one hand it enriches Mary's work, but it will also help us within the coalition and the TPP to think further on how to address and take those things into account as we develop our activities together with you in the future. At this juncture, we're going towards the tail end of the conversation. But before we do that, we are honored to have with us today the Ambassador of Costa Rica to the UN agencies here in New York, and Ambassador Maritza Chan Valverde. So thanks for taking time. And just before we close, we just wanted to ask you a few questions as part of the discussions we're having, just to have a perspective from one of the countries who are active both in agroecology, but also in the 3 Rio conventions. Yeah. I just wanted to have a sense of why do you think it is important for countries like Costa Rica and others to make sure that agroecology is embedded in your national priorities and policies?
Okay.
Madam Ambassador.
Thank you so much. I want to greet our in-person and online participants for being here today and to address one of the issues that we have not paid enough attention, because everybody's talking about the energy crisis, the economic crisis, the social crisis, but we haven't spoken enough of the food crisis. And this is key in order to achieve SDG 2. So first, please allow me to thank the Agroecology Coalition for this opportunity and to share the experience of Costa Rica as an active member of this important endeavor in favor of the dignity and health of all people and the ecosystems that sustain life. As we know, these multiple crises are having a tremendous impact on SDG 2. And in this regard, I would like to make 3 concrete points. The first one, it is clear that we need to ensure greater sustainability of food systems, especially in production and consumption. That's relevant. Although Costa Rica's agricultural sector faces a number of challenges through our Public Policy for Agricultural Sector 2022-2032, it's a 10-year program. We are making progress in important areas such as productivity, competitiveness, sustainability, climate change adaptation and mitigation, strengthening family agriculture, and the use of technological tools that encourage greater participation of young people in food production. Both in public and the private management, agroecology represents an important and a crucial basis for integrated water resource management, soil management and conservation, animal welfare, biodiversity protection, crop diversification, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, composting and recycling of nutrients, use of bioinputs for crop phytoprotection and nutrition, capacity building for vulnerable groups, development of local markets, among other challenges. In this sense, the role of science in promoting solutions that strengthen the principles of agroecology is fundamental. That takes me to the second point I would like to make today. It is key to ensure that local smallholder and family farmers are well compensated for providing quality, sustainable produce. And I can tell you that because I come from a long line of coffee producers. We have been producing coffee for more than 100 years. And this is one of the most time invested and long hour jobs that there are. So there is something about agriculture and working long hours and making sure that we have agroecology together that makes it sustainable, but also profitable for those who work the longest. Smallholder and family farmers continue to be in a race to the bottom, and that is completely unfair in order to produce more but cheaper. This means that they often, and we do often, assume the highest cost of out of the value chain, which make it much difficult to afford ecological production methods. For this, financial inclusion is key, both at the government level, but also by engaging the private sector. We do need public and private partnerships. This would allow more stable incomes, transitions to more sustainable production systems, and stimulate local and especially rural economies where the majority of our poor live. And let me add to this, where the majority of the workers are women and young people and children. It is inconceivable that those who produce our food could be among the poorest in the world. It's immoral, it's unfair, and shame on us for not honoring their work. Finally, my last point and my last message is to motivate more countries and organizations to be part of building solutions for the strengthening of agroecology as a basis for the development of sustainable food systems. All actors, all hands on deck, must intensify our collective environmental ambition, but we must also accelerate the implementation of that ambition to fulfill our responsibility with present and future generations, to implement without any delay a just transition, a transition with a human face, a dignified transition with solutions to climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So I thank you once again for being here today and for honoring the work of those who work the longest hours for the lowest pay. And I hope that we can change that paradigm and truly do this shift that will respect the dignity of those who make sure that we have food on our tables. I thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ambassador Chen. Thank you very much for this important food for thought. And last but not the least, we also want to call in one of our co-sponsors, co-supporters for organizing this event. And I'd like to call in His Excellency Ambassador Diaman Diome, Deputy Permanent Representative of Senegal to the UN agencies here in New York. Monsieur Ambassadeur, à vous la parole.
Join me. Comment ça va?
Ça va, Madame l'ambassadeur. Vous allez bien?
Bien.
Ce micro? Allô? Merci beaucoup, cher Olivier. Merci beaucoup. Voilà, je vais m'exprimer en anglais comme il est convenu. Excellencies, dear colleague and participant, at the outset, I would like to convey the greeting of Ambassador Cheikhnia, our permanent representative, the permanent representative of Senegal, who was unable to be with us today due to a conflict of agenda. I would like also to express my appreciation to Agroecology Coalition, the TPP on agroecology, and the Permanent Mission of France for associating Senegal to this very timely event, as it gives us the opportunity to exchange on agroecology transition and to reflect on strong recommendation for the 2024 Summit of the Future. For our countries, the present global food crisis has added to pressing climatic, economic, and humanitarian challenges. Biodiversity loss, for example, coastal erosion, drought, loss of Arab lands, demographic pressure, and dwindling water resources, to name a few. We have no other choice but to come to terms with current realities and adapt our agriculture production to these challenges, notably by adopting an approach that takes greater account of the functioning of our ecosystem as a whole, including the economic, social, and political dimension of our agriculture. This is why we must pay a particular attention to agroecology, which is one of the fittest responses to climate change. That is also the reason why we need to make the transition to fairer, more resilient, and sustainable agriculture models. To this respect, allow me to praise the panelists and the audience for the relevance of the discussion during the 3 sessions we had today, this morning. Same goes for the representative of governments, civil societies, and academia who have been participating in person or virtually to this event. I would particularly like to highlight the special attention paid to the agroecological science, which is key in popularizing the principles and values of agroecology as a solution to the combined equation of hunger and climate change. Second, the agroecological practices and their differentiated impacts on social inequalities and development gap, North and South, particularly in Africa. The special focus also on the contribution of agroecology in promoting more equitable food systems. And last but not least, the advocacy in favor of more agroecology-wise national policies, particularly in favoring research as well as technical and technological innovation. Dear participants, strong ideas have emerged today. Ideas that underpin a common understanding of the issue of challenges related to agroecology when it comes to the implementation of the SDGs. Ideas that should generate interesting prospects for the summit of the future. I have no doubt that Agroecology Coalition will be able to transform these ideas into a common set of recommendations for the 9th edition of the UNGA 78 Science Summit. I cannot conclude without pleading for my continent, Africa, on this matter. Africa is determined to be more self-dependent by encouraging the local processing of agriculture products so that the continent produces what it consumes and consumes what it produces. The continent is in demand of partnership that are tailored to achieve such goals. To this end, research is out to be a domain of strategic interest so that farmers can move towards smart, resilient, and less polluting agriculture. With technology transfer and appropriate financing, we can make Africa a breadbasket for the world. No need to say the importance of existing regional food security initiatives, such as the $1.5 billion Africa Emergency Food Production Facility, and the Technologies for Africa Agriculture Transformation Program, in order to diversify production areas, agriculture products, and food systems. I hope that our discussion today will help generate the political momentum we need for decisive step in fostering an environment conducive to the development of agroecology in Africa and worldwide. You can count on Senegal commitment and resolution to walk the talk with you all. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Ambassador. Merci. Well, dear friends, excellencies, our friends online and here in person, in the face of devastating impacts of industrial intensive food systems, climate emergency, rising hunger, biodiversity destruction, pandemics, and declining soil fertility, we urgently need to transform the way we farm and the way we nourish ourselves. The transformation of food systems through agroecology supports biodiversity and promotes resilience, while supporting livelihoods and address equity. It promotes soil health and produces healthy, diversified, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food. It is thus a fundamental part of transformation to a healthy future for a healthy planet. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you for your participation. And as we break today and prepare your meals and eat your lunch here, and for those who are joining online, let us remember and honor those people who produce the food that we'll eat, and think about those who don't have anything on the table. Thank you very much. Have a good day, and onwards and forward. Thank you.